a small town in the interior of the United States where everyone knew everyone and life seemed to go on smoothly, there lived a lonely man named Thomas. He was around 40 years old, with gray hair and eyes that carried an invisible weight, the result of long-buried pain. Thomas spent his days working as a mechanic in the only workshop in town, but his life wasn't always like that. Many years ago, he had a younger sister, Emily, with whom he shared an unbreakable bond. They were inseparable, but one tragic day, Emily disappeared without a trace. She was just 17 at the time, and her disappearance deeply shook Thomas and his family. The only clue that remained was a silver necklace with a small star-shaped pendant, which Emily always wore. Over time, the searches and hopes faded, and Thomas closed in on himself, living with the guilt and pain of not having been able to. One cold autumn morning, while walking through the town square on his way to the workshop, Thomas saw a lost boy crying next to a bench. The boy, who looked to be around 8 or 9 years old, was alone and visibly scared. Thomas, who despite his loneliness had always been a good-hearted person, approached slowly, trying not to scare the boy. "Hey, how are you?" he asked in a soft voice. "Are you lost?" The boy, his eyes still full of tears, nodded slowly. He explained that he had become separated from his mother at the grocery store and didn't know how to get home. Thomas, feeling a paternal instinct he didn't know he had, offered to help him. "What is your name?" Thomas asked. "Daniel," replied the boy, still sobbing. Thomas then held out his hand, and the boy, trusting the stranger, took it without hesitation. As they walked together towards the market, Thomas noticed something that made his heart stop for a moment. Around Daniel's neck hung a silver necklace with a star-shaped pendant, the same star he had seen so many times on his sister Emily's neck. Thomas felt a mixture of shock and hope mix in his chest. He asked gently, "That necklace, where did you get it?" Daniel looked at Thomas confused and replied, "My mother gave it to me. She said it belonged to someone very special." Thomas's mind began to spin. Could it be possible that this necklace was the same one Emily wore? And if so, how did he end up with Daniel and his mother? Unanswered questions filled his mind as they continued walking. When they arrived at the market, Thomas found Daniel's mother, a tired-looking woman, but with a kind smile on her face. She was relieved to see her son, thanking Thomas profusely. But Thomas, still shaken, couldn't help but ask, "I'm sorry, but I need to know. Where did you get the necklace your son is wearing?" The woman, surprised by the question, hesitated for a moment before answering. "That necklace? It's a family heirloom. My brother left it with me before he disappeared." Thomas's world seemed to shake. Could this woman be his sister? Was it possible that Emily was alive, hidden under a new identity? But if so, why didn't she ever look for him? And why was the necklace now with this woman and her son? As answers began to emerge, Thomas knew he was at the beginning of a journey that would lead him to revisit past pains and perhaps finally get the answers he had been seeking for so many years. As the woman's words echoed in Thomas's mind, he found himself at an emotional crossroads. The idea that this woman could be his lost sister filled him with a mixture of hope and fear. But he knew he couldn't make hasty accusations. I needed concrete answers, and the only way to get them was to investigate further, without scaring her or causing alarm. That night, back in the solitude of his small apartment, Thomas couldn't sleep. Memories of Emily flooded his mind, along with the questions that now tormented him. He wondered how to start broaching the subject with his wife without seeming crazy or invasive. He decided that the next day he would try to get to know her better, perhaps establishing a friendship before revealing his suspicions. However, fate had its own plans. The next day, while Thomas was in the workshop, the woman appeared. Her name was Rachel, and she had Daniel with her. With a shy smile, she thanked him again for his help the day before and mentioned that her car was having problems. It was a perfect opportunity for Thomas, who offered his services to fix it. While working on the car, Thomas took the opportunity to ask casual questions about Rachel's life. He discovered that she had moved to the city just a few months ago from a neighboring town. Her husband had passed away a few years ago, and she was raising Daniel alone. Rachel spoke fondly about her late brother, who disappeared when she was young, but without going into much detail. Each new piece of information made Thomas more certain that there was a connection between Rachel and Emily. But he knew he couldn't pressure her. Instead, he offered to show her around the city and help her adjust to her new home. Rachel, grateful for his kindness, accepted the offer, and little by little the two began to spend more time together. As the days went by, Thomas got closer and closer to Rachel and Daniel. He began to grow attached to the boy, seeing in him the innocence and kindness he had always associated with Emily. But doubt and uncertainty continued to gnaw at him. How could he find out the truth without hurting anyone? It was during a quiet afternoon while Thomas, Rachel, and Daniel were strolling through a park that an unexpected turn of events occurred. Daniel, who was playing near a lake, tripped and fell into the water. Without thinking twice, Thomas ran to save him. He pulled the boy out of the water, and as Rachel ran to help them, something fell out of Daniel's pocket. It was an old piece of paper, already faded, but with familiar handwriting. Thomas took the paper, and as he read it, he felt the ground. The note was a letter addressed to someone named Tommy, Emily's nickname for Thomas. The letter, written in Emily's delicate and familiar handwriting, talked about her struggle to escape a dangerous situation and how she had to leave everything behind, including her name. She mentioned that if he ever found this letter, he should know that she was safe, but that he could not return, for everyone's sake. Thomas froze. The evidence was there in his hands. Rachel was, in fact, his sister Emily, but at the same time he understood that she had left her old life behind for a serious reason. But what would that reason be? Who or what forced her to change her identity and abandon everything? Rachel noticed Thomas's dazed look and asked if he was okay. Still processing what he had discovered, he covered it up, putting the letter in his pocket, promising himself that he would need to confront her soon, but in the right way. He needed to understand what led her to make such a drastic choice and, more importantly, if there was anything she still needed to protect herself from. In the weeks that followed, Thomas began discreetly investigating Emily's past. He visited neighboring towns, talked to old acquaintances, and even met some of his sister's old friends. Little by little, he began to piece together the puzzle of a life full of secrets he could never have imagined. He discovered that years ago, Emily was involved with a dangerous person, someone who didn't accept being left behind. When she tried to escape, this man threatened to destroy everything she loved. So Emily, to protect her family and herself, disappeared, creating a new life under the name Rachel. With these revelations, Thomas faced a painful dilemma. He could confront Rachel with what he knew, bringing back memories she had clearly tried to bury. But this could also bring danger to her and Daniel, if the man from the past was still lurking. On the other hand, he could leave things as they were, keeping the secret and trying to protect her from afar. However, the idea of continuing to live in a lie, without being able to fully reconnect with his sister, was something Thomas didn't know if he could bear. Thomas could no longer ignore the truth. The weight of the letter and the reality that his sister was alive but living as someone else were burdens too heavy to bear alone. He decided the only way to move forward was to confront Rachel, but do so cautiously. He needed answers, but he also wanted to protect the new life she had built. He chose a quiet weekend to invite Rachel and Daniel for a walk in the countryside. They drove along country roads, surrounded by trees that were beginning to display the vibrant colors of autumn. Thomas suggested a picnic in a secluded place where they could talk without interruptions. While Daniel ran through the fields, Thomas and Rachel sat in the shade of a large tree, the gentle wind carrying with it the smell of earth and fallen leaves. The mood was perfect, but the tension between the two was palpable. Thomas knew that the time to reveal what he knew had arrived. "Rachel," he began, trying to keep his voice steady, "I need to talk about something important, something that has been tormenting me since we met." Rachel looked at him, noticing the seriousness in his tone. "What happened, Thomas?" she asked, a note of concern in her voice. Thomas took a deep breath and with a slow, deliberate gesture took the letter from his pocket. He held it carefully as if it were a fragile treasure. "I found this," he said, handing the letter to Rachel. "It was in Daniel's pocket the day he fell into the lake." Rachel took the letter, and when she recognized her own handwriting, her face paled. She began to shake and tears began to form in her eyes. "Where did you find this?" she whispered. her voice breaking with emotion. "I found it on the floor," Thomas said, trying to remain calm. "But that's not what matters now. Rachel, this letter was written by Emily, my sister. And you, Rachel, you're Emily, aren't you?" Rachel closed her eyes, tears now streaming freely down her face. She knew she could no longer hide the truth. With a heavy sigh, she nodded. "Yes, Thomas, it's me, Emily." Thomas's heart jumped, and at the same time it hurt. The confirmation he so feared and desired at the same time was there, in front of him. He walked over and held Emily's hands. "Why did you do that? Why didn't you ever come back?" he asked, his voice filled with pain and confusion. Emily looked into Thomas's eyes, and everything she had hidden for so many years began to surface. "I had no choice, Tommy. At that time I got involved with a horrible person. I thought it was love, but when I tried to leave, it threatened to destroy everything I loved, including you. I knew that if I stayed around, he would make good on his threats. So I disappeared. I changed my name, my life, everything. It was the only way to protect all of you." Thomas felt anger and sadness well up inside him. The desire to protect Emily was even stronger now, but he knew that danger could still lurk. "And him, is he still around?" Thomas asked, his voice low, fearing the answer. Emily looked away to where Daniel was playing and whispered, "I don't know. But I live in fear every day, always looking over your shoulder, waiting for him to appear again." Thomas squeezed Emily's hands tighter. "We need to do something. We cannot continue living like this, hidden and in fear. I lost you once, Emily. I won't lose you again." Emily wiped away her tears, but the pain was still evident on her face. "What do you suggest, Thomas? He is a powerful man with connections in places we can't even imagine. It's not safe to face someone like that." Thomas was silent for a moment, thinking about all the possibilities. He knew he would need help and that the situation was much more dangerous than he had imagined. But one thing was clear to him. He wouldn't let Emily face this alone. "I know some people who can help us," Thomas said finally. "People who can protect us and make sure he doesn't harm you or Daniel." Emily looked hesitant, but the determined expression on Thomas's face gave her hope. She knew that the brother she loved would not allow anything to happen to her again. "Let's do this together then," Emily said with renewed firmness. "But we need to be careful. He's dangerous, and once he knows I'm back, he could do anything to destroy me." Thomas nodded, knowing they were about to embark on a battle that would test all the limits of his courage and determination. But for the first time in years, he felt there was a chance to regain peace and finally bring his sister back into his life. The decision was made. Thomas and Emily knew they couldn't continue living in fear, and that they needed to act before the past caught up with them again. In the days following the revelation, Thomas used his few connections in the city to seek help from someone who could offer protection and guidance. Thomas's old co-worker, who was now a private detective, seemed to be the only hope. The detective, named Mike, was a middle-aged man with a serious countenance but a generous heart. He had known Thomas during the years they both worked in a factory before going their separate ways. When Thomas explained the situation to him, Mike agreed to help, but not without warning about the risks. "If this guy is as dangerous as you say, we need to be extremely careful. Any false move could put them in even greater danger," Mike warned, with a serious tone. Thomas and Emily knew they were dealing with something much bigger than they imagined, but they also understood that this was the only way they could free themselves from the fear that surrounded them. Mike began to discreetly investigate, trying to find any trace of the man threatening Emily, while Thomas and Emily began preparing a possible escape in case things got out of control. Meanwhile, Emily faced a whirlwind of emotions. Being back in his brother's life was both a relief and a burden. On the one hand, she felt safer knowing that Thomas was by her side, but on the other, the guilt of leaving him for so many years weighed heavily on her shoulders. Plus, she had Daniel to protect, and the fear that he might be targeted by the man chasing her kept her awake at night. Thomas, in turn, felt a mixture of anger and determination. Anger for everything Emily had suffered, and determination to make sure she never had to live in fear again. Every day, he grew closer to his sister, rediscovering the bond they had lost. But he also knew they were in a race against time. Weeks passed, and Mike finally brought news. He had discovered that the man Emily feared so much, known as Jack Murdoch, was still active, involved in shady dealings and with a network of contacts that stretched across the country. Mike explained that Murdoch was a dangerous man who would not hesitate to use violence to get what he wanted. "He's the type to solve problems quickly and quietly," Mike said. "We need to be smarter than him, and we can't let him know we're on his trail." With this new information, the plan began to take shape. Mike advised Thomas and Emily to act as if everything was normal, so as not to arouse suspicion. But behind the scenes, they were preparing for the possibility of facing Murdoch directly. Mike also managed to locate some people who had been victims of Murdoch in the past, hoping to gather enough evidence to incriminate him. As the plan unfolded, Thomas and Emily experienced moments of reflection and growth. Emily, who had lived in fear for so long, began to regain her inner strength, determined to protect her son and brother at any cost. She knew that running away was no longer an option, and that facing her past demons was the only path to peace. Thomas, on the other hand, realized he needed to leave the guilty past behind and focus on the present. He had spent so many years dwelling on the loss of Emily that now that she was back, he was determined not to let the past destroy their future. He began to see life in a new light where protecting his family was his absolute priority. The tension grew every day. Mike brought forward more information that indicated Murdoch was involved in illegal activities, but proving this would be difficult. They needed something concrete to bring him to justice, and to do that, they would need to risk everything. The day came when Mike got a solid lead. Murdoch was in a clandestine meeting in the neighboring city, discussing new business with his cronies. It was the chance they needed to catch Murdoch red-handed, but it was also a risky operation. If something went wrong, everyone could be in danger. Thomas and Emily knew this was the defining moment. With Mike's help, they prepared to confront Murdoch, devising a plan to expose him and ensure he paid for his crimes. Emily, in an act of courage, decided that she would confront Murdoch herself, with Thomas and Mike by her side. She knew that to close that chapter in her life, she would need to face the man who had destroyed her past. On the night of the operation, Thomas's heart was beating fast. They positioned themselves in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to act. When Murdoch finally appeared, surrounded by his men, Emily took a deep breath and determinedly took a step forward. "Jack Murdoch," she called, her voice firm despite her fear. Murdoch turned to her, surprised to see a figure from the past he believed he had left behind. "Emily," he said, shock evident on his face. "I thought you were dead." "I've been dead for a long time, Jack," Emily replied, "but that ends now." Murdoch laughed, a cold, cruel laugh. But before he could make any move, Thomas and Mike emerged from the shadows, armed with the evidence they needed. The situation quickly became tense, but with Mike's cunning and Thomas and Emily's courage, they managed to put Murdoch in a position where he had nowhere to escape. The night was thick with tension, and the air felt thick around Thomas, Emily, and Mike. In the dark parking lot of the neighboring city, under the dim light of a streetlight, Jack Murdoch stared at Emily with a mix of surprise and contempt. He still didn't understand how she had reappeared in his life, but it was clear that her arrival was no coincidence. Thomas watched the confrontation closely, his heart beating fast. The sister he had lost for so long was there, facing the man who had turned his life into a nightmare. Emily's courage was evident, but so was her vulnerability. He knew this was the decisive moment. "You shouldn't have come back, Emily," Murdoch said in a threatening tone. "I warned you to stay away forever. And now you risk everything for what? For revenge?" Emily kept her stance firm even though her heart was racing. She knew that any mistake could be fatal, but she couldn't let fear dominate. "I'm not here for revenge, Jack," she replied with surprising calm. "I'm here to put an end to this once and for all. You will no longer control me. It will no longer destroy my life or that of my family." Thomas stepped forward, placing himself next to Emily. He wouldn't allow her to face this man alone. Mike, on the other side, was prepared, keeping a firm hand on his gun, but waiting for the right moment to act. "It's the end of the line for you, Murdoch," Thomas said, his voice thick with determination. "You've already caused enough pain, and it ends today." Murdoch laughed, a dry, cruel sound that echoed in the darkness around them. He looked at Thomas and then at Emily, assessing the situation. His confidence was unshakable, as if he was sure he was still in control. You think you can just take me down? Murdoch scoffed. I have more power than you imagine. If you do anything to me, you will all suffer the consequences. You have no idea what you are facing. But before he could say anything else, Mike made a discreet sign to Thomas and Emily. The time had come. In a quick and coordinated move, Mike revealed the recording he had managed to capture of Murdoch's conversation with his cronies, where he admitted his crimes from extortion to threats of violence. We have everything we need, Murdoch, Mike said with calculated calm. This recording will be enough to put him behind bars for a long time, and this time, you won't escape. Murdoch paled, realizing the situation had turned against him. He tried to reach for something in his coat, but before he could react, Thomas and Mike were already in position, ready to stop any movement. Murdoch was cornered. It's the end, Jack, Emily said, approaching slowly. All these years I lived in fear of you, but now, finally, I can say that fear is over. I have my family back, and you no longer have power over me. Murdoch tried to resist, but it was in vain. The arrival of the police sirens, which Mike had discreetly called, marked the end of his impunity. He was handcuffed and taken away, still shouting empty threats that had no effect on Emily anymore. The man who had been the ghost of his past was now being brought to face justice. When the police finally left, taking Murdoch with them, the feeling of relief washed over Thomas and Emily like a wave. It was as if a huge weight had been lifted from their lives. Emily turned to Thomas, and the two hugged, feeling the warmth and security that only family could offer. You saved me, Tommy, Emily whispered, holding him tightly. I could never have done this alone. Thomas, with eyes full of tears, smiled and replied, We saved each other. Now we can truly live in peace. As they walked away from the place, Emily looked up at the sky, where the stars were shining brightly. The star-shaped pendant she always wore, and which was now safely in her pocket, seemed to shine with a light of its own, like a symbol of everything she had overcome. For the first time in many years, she felt free. The days following Jack Murdoch's arrest were like a new dawn in Thomas and Emily's lives. News of the arrest of one of the region's most dangerous criminals spread quickly, and with it, the truth about Emily's story began to come to light. But this time, there was no fear or shame in his narrative, just the feeling that a cycle had finally come to an end. Emily, now free from the weight of her past, began to rebuild her life with renewed strength. She continued to live in the small town where she had found her brother, but this time, without the constant fear of being discovered. The community, which initially saw her as a shy new resident, now welcomed her with affection and respect. Admiring her courage, Thomas also underwent a transformation. The years of pain and guilt he carried for failing to protect Emily were replaced by a deep pride in his sister. He returned to work in the workshop with a new perspective, knowing that he had finally managed to protect those he loved. But more than that, he found a new purpose in his life, to ensure that the peace they had won was preserved. With Mike's help, they also began reaching out to other people who had been victims of Murdoch, trying to offer them the same closure that they themselves had achieved. Mike, whose friendship and loyalty were critical to the success of their plan, became a constant presence in their lives, not just as a protector but as a dear friend. Daniel, the little boy whose necklace triggered this journey, returned to the routine of an ordinary child, playing and exploring the world around him without the shadow of fear that had hung over his family. Now, he was growing up in an environment full of love and security, surrounded by those who loved him unconditionally. On a sunny afternoon a few weeks after Murdoch's arrest, Thomas, Emily, and Daniel decided to take a trip to a lakeside cabin, a place that Thomas and Emily used to visit when they were children. It was a peaceful retreat, surrounded by trees and with a spectacular view of the sunset, reflecting off the calm water. As the sun began to set, coloring the sky with shades of orange and pink, Emily stepped away for a moment, walking to the lakeshore. She took the necklace out of her pocket, the star pendant shining in the sunlight. With a sense of peace, she held him for a moment, remembering everything he represented, not just the pain of the past, but also the hope and resilience that brought her here. Thomas approached silently, stopping next to Emily. The two stood there in silence, watching the sun disappear over the horizon. After a moment, Emily sighed and, with a calm smile, placed the necklace around Daniel's neck, who had joined them. "This necklace has belonged to our family for a long time," she said softly to Daniel. "He is a symbol of strength and courage, and now he is yours. So that you always remember that no matter what happens, you will always have your family by your side." Daniel, his eyes shining with joy and an understanding beyond his years, hugged his mother and uncle, feeling safer than ever. As the last ray of sunlight disappeared, Thomas and Emily knew they were finally at peace with their past. They had been through dark times, but now, together, they could look to the future with hope and confidence. And most importantly, they had each other, a connection that could never be broken again. Their journey of overcoming had come to an end, but the lessons they learned and the love they shared would guide them forever. Months have passed since Thomas, Emily, and Daniel's lives changed forever. The small town they lived in now seemed more peaceful than ever, with the seasons changing and bringing new colors and sensations to everyday life. But for them, each day also brought a new beginning, a chance to live without the weight of the past. Emily, finally at peace, began working at a small cafe in the town, where she became a beloved figure among the locals. Her inner strength and resilience inspired those around her, and she became more involved in the community, participating in events and helping those in need. She also started writing a diary, where she recorded her memories and reflections on everything she had experienced, a way of transforming her pain into wisdom. Thomas continued his workshop, but now with a renewed sense of purpose. He had found a new passion in restoring old cars, something he had always dreamed of doing but never had the time or energy. The workshop became a meeting point for friends, where stories were told and bonds were strengthened. Thomas also started a project with Mike to help other crime victims find justice and peace, something he considered a life mission. Daniel, still young, flourished with the freedom and security that his new life provided. He was more confident, making friends at school and exploring his own passions, such as art and music. The necklace with the star pendant never left his neck, a symbol of everything his family had overcome and the strength he knew he also possessed. On one special day, Thomas, Emily, and Daniel returned to the lake cabin, now a place of celebration and happy memories. They spent the day together, fishing, telling stories, and simply enjoying each other's company. As night fell, they sat around a campfire, the flames dancing against the starry sky. Emily looked up at the stars, remembering everything they had been through. She knew that life would still bring challenges, but now, she felt equipped to face them. She had her family, her peace, and a new sense of purpose. Thomas, by his side, thought about the future, but this time with hope and optimism. He knew that together they could face anything that came their way. And Daniel, holding the star necklace, looked up and smiled, feeling connected to something bigger, something strong and unshakable. Under the starry sky, they knew that despite all the odds, they were exactly where they were supposed to be. Together, at peace and ready for whatever the future held for them.